For 2,000 years, this carving has been sitting on a wall in Egypt, and it looks like a light bulb. Not kind of. Not if you squint, not if someone points at it and asks you to use your imagination. It looks like a light bulb the way a child's drawing of the sun looks like the sun. Unmistakable, unavoidable. The first thing your brain says before your brain has time to talk itself out of it. Egyptologists have an answer for this. They've had the same answer for over 60 years. And today, we're going to test that answer against something it has never had to face before. An artificial intelligence built by Elon Musk's own company, handed nothing but the raw data and asked one simple question. What is this actually a picture of? What Grok AI came back with didn't settle the argument, but it changed the shape of it completely. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why researchers who have studied this carving for decades stopped and looked again. If ancient mysteries and AI investigations are your thing, hit subscribe, because this discovery only gets stranger from here. Let's go to Dendera, the temple that holds more than it shows. Roughly 300 BCE. Egypt is no longer ruled by pharaohs of Egyptian blood. Alexander the Great has come and gone, and in his wake, the Ptolemaic dynasty, Greek by ancestry, Egyptian by adoption, controls the Nile. It's during this period that the Temple of Hathor at Dendera, as it stands today, is constructed. 40,000 square meters of sandstone, sanctuaries stacked on sanctuaries, crypts buried beneath crypts. It is, without exaggeration, one of the best preserved temple complexes to survive from the ancient world. Walk through its main hall today, and you'll see something almost nowhere else in Egypt: full-color painted ceilings, ochres and blues that have held their pigment for over 2,000 years. But here's the detail that most tourists walk straight past and that most casual documentaries never mention. Dendera wasn't built on empty ground. Inscriptions carved into the temple's own walls, not modern speculation, not fringe theory, actual hieroglyphic text, reference earlier structures that stood on this exact site, structures going back to the Old Kingdom. That's not a few generations before the Ptolemaic build. That's more than 2,000 years earlier. The ground beneath Dendera was sacred before the pyramids at Giza had finished settling into the desert. Why does that matter? Because when an Egyptologist stands in front of a Ptolemaic-era relief and tells you this is standard imagery for the period, they are telling you the truth about one thing only: when the chisel touched the stone. They are not telling you when the idea being carved was born. Ancient Egyptian religious architecture was not built to erase the past. It was built to preserve it, layer it, and carry it forward. The priests directing construction at Dendera were not inventing new theology on the spot. They were working from a symbolic inheritance that stretched back through dynasties, through kingdoms, through collapses and rebirths of Egyptian civilization itself. So what they chose to put on the walls, especially the walls that mattered most, wasn't just the fashion of 300 BCE. It was the accumulated weight of everything that came before it. And nowhere in the temple is that weight heavier than in the crypts. Beneath the floor of the Hathor temple, there are 6 of them, small, sealed, built into the substructure itself, invisible from the public halls above. These weren't spaces for ordinary worshippers. They weren't even spaces for most priests. The crypts at Dendera were restricted to a narrow circle of initiated clergy, the kind of access that, in any other ancient culture, would be reserved for the people trusted with the most dangerous or the most sacred knowledge an institution possessed. The south crypts are where our carving lives. These particular chambers were used to store sacred ritual objects, statuary, ceremonial implements, items too significant or too dangerous, symbolically speaking, to be left in the open temple above. Here's the point that too many documentaries skip past in their rush to get to the shocking part. Restricted spaces in ancient religious institutions do not usually contain decoration for decoration's sake. When you carve something into a wall that almost nobody will ever be allowed to see, you are not doing it to look pretty for the public. You are recording something, preserving something, encoding something for the small number of people who are permitted to understand it. That single fact should recalibrate how seriously we take what's carved on those walls. And it's exactly the fact that most casual explanations of "it's just a lotus flower" tend to leave out. The engineer who couldn't look away, 1966, Vienna. An Austrian electrical engineer named Walter Gahn is going through photographs of Egyptian temple reliefs, not as a treasure hunter, not as a conspiracy theorist, but as a professional with decades of training in exactly one specific field: how electrical components are built and what they look like. He has no particular interest in ancient mysteries. He isn't looking for anything. And then he finds it. A large, elongated, bulb-shaped form. Inside it, extending from base to tip, a serpent, floating, not touching the outer wall of the bulb at any point along its length. At the base of the bulb, where the form narrows and connects to a vertical column beneath it, there's a specific junction, a transition point, and the column itself, seen in cross-section, has a layered structure, something in the middle, flanked on either side by distinct material. Gahn doesn't see mythology first, he sees engineering. And what he sees, specifically, is something that looks like a Crookes tube. For anyone who's never encountered the term, a Crookes tube is a sealed glass vacuum tube developed by British physicist William Crookes in the 1870s, with a cathode at one end and an anode at the other. Run an electrical charge through it, and inside that vacuum you get a visible glow, a stream of what we'd later understand to be electrons, traveling in a straight, contained path from one end to the other without touching the glass. Crookes tubes are not a historical footnote. They're the ancestor of X-ray technology, discovered by Wilhelm Röntgen, using this exact apparatus in 1895. They're the direct ancestor of cathode ray tube televisions that sat in living rooms for most of the 20th century. Gahn's specific claim was narrow and worth stating precisely because a lot of retellings blow past the nuance. He said the carving is consistent with a Crookes tube, not that it definitely depicts one, consistent with a trained eye recognizing a shape. That distinction has mattered for 60 years because it's exactly what's kept this comparison alive, while so many other ancient technology claims have quietly disappeared from serious conversation. Gahn wasn't claiming certainty. He was pointing at a resemblance specific enough that dismissing it outright required more than a shrug. And here's the detail that made this stick instead of fade. This comparison did not come from someone trying to sell a documentary, a book, or a theory. It came from a person whose entire professional life was spent looking at exactly this kind of object: components, junctions, insulators, discharge tubes, and who looked at a 2,000-year-old carving and thought, "I know what that is." Mainstream Egyptology's response arrived fast, and it hasn't changed much since. This is a lotus flower with a serpent emerging from it, representing the primordial waters of creation, the moment in Egyptian mythology when the sun god rises from the chaos of none at the dawn of the world. It's a reading that fits comfortably inside everything we know about Egyptian cosmology. The lotus is one of the most common creation symbols in the entire mythological tradition. Serpents represent transformation, danger, and divine power throughout Egyptian religious art. That explanation isn't stupid. It isn't lazy. It's genuinely well supported by the broader symbolic language of the temple around it. But here's the uncomfortable truth that's followed this carving for 60 years. A reasonable explanation and a proven explanation are not the same thing. And this particular carving has an unusually stubborn habit of getting re-examined by people who are not required to accept a mythological reading just because it's convenient. So the question Ghan left behind, unanswerable with 1966 tools, was this: is the resemblance a coincidence of artistic geometry, or is it something else entirely? Something that survived inside religious language, because religious language was the only vessel capable of carrying it forward safely. That question sat dormant for decades, and then it landed in front of a machine that doesn't get tired, doesn't get embarrassed, and doesn't have a career riding on which answer it gives. The problem nobody wants to talk about: working in the dark. Before we get to what the AI actually did, we need to sit with a problem that exists completely independent of any light bulb carving. A problem that mainstream Egyptology has never fully closed the door on, no matter how many times it's been asked to. How did ancient Egyptians paint and carve some of their most intricate work in total darkness? Not dim light, not hard to see, total darkness. Many of the most elaborate tomb paintings in Egypt exist in chambers with zero natural light access, no windows, no shafts, nothing. Deep corridors cut through solid bedrock, sometimes turning multiple times before reaching the burial chamber itself. The tomb of Ramesses VI is a textbook example. Astronomical ceiling paintings of extraordinary complexity, located in a space where an open flame would have been fighting for oxygen the entire time it burned. Think about what that actually requires. You need consistent, even bright illumination to paint fine detail. You need that illumination for hours at a stretch. You need it in a sealed underground space where smoke has nowhere to go, and flame consumes the very air the artist is trying to breathe. The standard explanation, and it's worth stating fairly because it's not unreasonable, is polished bronze mirrors, positioned to catch sunlight at the entrance and bounce it, mirror to mirror, progressively deeper into the structure, supplemented where needed by oil lamps. For shallow chambers close to an opening, this works fine. Nobody disputes that. The problem shows up in the deepest, most tightly angled spaces, where the number of reflections required to get usable light to the working surface becomes so long and the light losses at each bounce so significant that what actually reaches the wall would be a dim, workable at best glow. Not the kind of light that produces the fine line work we actually see. And then there's the detail that keeps this conversation from ever fully closing. The ceilings don't have soot, burn anything, oil, wax, resin, wood, in an enclosed space for the hours or days it would take to complete elaborate ceiling artwork, and you get carbon residue. It settles on the nearest surface, which in these chambers is almost always the ceiling directly above the flame. It's not a subtle effect. It's how we know, in plenty of other ancient sites, that lamps were used, because the soot is right there, physically present, chemically testable. In several of the most elaborately decorated crypt ceilings at Dendera specifically, that residue is absent. Researchers have taken samples, the carbon signature that should be there if these spaces were illuminated by combustion for the length of time required to produce this level of artistic detail, isn't showing up consistently. The mainstream counter-arguments exist, and we should give them their full weight. Maybe ventilation shafts we haven't identified carried the smoke away. Maybe a specific, unusually clean burning wax was used that modern chemical analysis hasn't fully reconstructed. Both are plausible. Neither has been demonstrated conclusively for every affected chamber. To be absolutely clear about what this does and doesn't mean, the missing soot does not prove ancient Egypt had electric lighting. It proves something narrower and in some ways more interesting, that the standard explanation has a specific, identifiable, unresolved gap, not a hand wave, an actual evidentiary hole that nobody has fully filled. That gap is the reason a carving that looks like a light bulb doesn't get laughed out of the room the way it probably should if the darkness question had a clean answer. There's a secondary detail worth pausing on here because it rarely makes it into the conversation. Egyptologists have long pointed to inscriptions elsewhere in the temple complex that reference secrets of the House of Gold, workshops connected to the crypts where sacred metalwork was produced. Metalworking of any serious kind, ancient or modern, benefits enormously from consistent, controllable light. A flickering oil lamp is workable for rough labor. It's a poor tool for the kind of fine gilding and inlay work Dendera's craftsmen were clearly capable of, based on surviving objects from the same tradition. That doesn't prove anything about the bulb carving specifically. It does mean the why would they even need better lighting objection, which shows up constantly in comment sections under videos like this one. Doesn't hold up as well as it sounds like it should. There were entire categories of work happening in this temple complex that depended on exactly the kind of stable, close-range illumination that torches and lamps struggle to provide. The jar that proves they understood electricity. Now for the piece of this puzzle that almost never gets connected to Dendera in mainstream retellings, and it should be because it changes the entire framing of the question. 1938, Kujut Rabu, near Baghdad. German archaeologist Wilhelm König is cataloguing artifacts in the collection of the Baghdad Museum when he comes across a small clay jar about 14 centimeters tall. Inside it, a copper cylinder wrapped around an iron rod, the whole assembly sealed at the top with asphalt. Dated to roughly 250 BCE, which puts it almost exactly in the same window as the Dendera reliefs. When researchers later built a working replica and filled it with an acidic liquid, grape juice, vinegar, anything mildly acidic does the job, it produced a measurable electrical current, somewhere around 1 volt, modest by modern standards. But structurally, functionally, this is a galvanic cell. The same basic principle sitting inside every battery in your house today. 2 different metals, an electrolyte, a measurable flow of current. The mainstream explanation is electroplating, using electrical current to apply a thin layer of one metal over another, and there's real supporting evidence for this. Several gilded objects recovered from the same region show a coating uniformity that's genuinely difficult to explain through standard mechanical gold leaf application. That consistency is much easier to produce with an electrical process. Here's why this matters for everything we've talked about so far. The debate about the Baghdad battery isn't really did the ancient world understand electricity, yes or no. The evidence already answers that. They understood the principle that certain material combinations in the presence of the right liquid generate current. That's not speculation. That's chemistry that works exactly the same way today as it did in 250 BCE. The real question, the one that actually connects the Baghdad battery to Dendera, is one of scale. A jar producing about a volt is enough for electroplating. It is nowhere close to enough, on its own, to produce visible light through a vacuum discharge. That requires meaningfully more voltage, a way to generate or store considerably more current, and critically, an understanding of vacuum conditions inside a sealed container. That's a much bigger technical leap than two metals and some vinegar. So the honest version of this question isn't, did they have electricity? It's, did the understanding demonstrated by the Baghdad battery ever extend further than we've been willing to consider? That is the exact question the Dendera carving reopens, and it's the question that was eventually put in front of Grok AI, what Grok AI was actually asked to do. Here's where this story becomes genuinely different from every previous attempt to crack the Dendera mystery. Every human researcher who has looked at this carving, Gan included, has approached it the same way, visually, as an image compared against other images, judged by eye, argued about in journals and forums, where the final verdict usually comes down to whose interpretation feels more convincing. The approach taken with Grok AI was deliberately different. Instead of asking, "What does this image remind you of?" the system was set up to treat the carving as a technical documentation problem, the same category of question you'd ask about a blueprint, not a painting. Does this image describe the proportions, relationships, and physical logic of a real object with a level of precision that goes beyond artistic resemblance? That's a meaningfully different question, and it's worth sitting with why. Art history asks about meaning. Engineering analysis asks about function, whether the internal relationships in an image are the kind you'd only get from someone describing how something actually works, not just what it looked like from across a room. To run that comparison, the model was given detailed dimensional data taken from the reliefs themselves. Proportional relationships between the bulb shape, the internal serpent element, and the base connection feature, set alongside the known proportional logic of functional vacuum tube designs across different scales. Now, and this is important because it's the part where a lot of viral retellings of this story get sloppy, what came out of that comparison should be understood as a pattern of proportional consistency, not a certified measurement with laboratory-grade precision. There's no independently verified, peer-reviewed data set behind a specific number you should treat as gospel. What the analysis flagged, in plain terms, was this: the relationships between the bulb's length and width, the position of the internal serpent relative to the ends of the bulb, and the proportions of the base connector were closer to what you'd expect from a functioning device than from a purely decorative freehand symbolic drawing. On its own, interesting, not conclusive. Proportions can align by accident. Artistic conventions can coincidentally echo functional geometry without anyone intending them to. What pushed the analysis further was the relationship between elements, treated as a system rather than isolated measurements. The serpent floats inside the bulb, never touching the outer wall along its full length, which is exactly how a discharge behaves inside an actual vacuum tube, contained but never contacting the glass. That's not really an artistic choice you'd expect to invent by coincidence. It's a specific physical behavior, and it shows up in the carving with striking specificity. The base connector, where the bulb meets the column beneath it, sits in a position and holds a proportional relationship to the bulb that mirrors where a cathode connection point sits in real tube designs. No single one of these details proves anything by itself, but stacked together, proportional geometry, the floating internal element, the base junction placement, the analysis flagged this as a pattern of technical consistency that goes further than you'd typically expect from independent artistic convention alone. To be completely fair to the skeptical side of this, because that's the responsible way to tell this story, none of this rises to proof. It's a structured, technically framed argument for taking the resemblance seriously, not a verdict, and it deserves to be treated exactly that way. The inscription nobody brings up. Here's a detail that almost never makes it into popular retellings of this story, and it might be the single most interesting piece of the whole puzzle. The carvings in the restricted south crypts aren't unlabeled. They're accompanied by hieroglyphic inscriptions that have been translated, published, and sitting in the academic record for over a century since Egyptologists first systematically documented the temple in the late 1800s and early 1900s. The dominant scholarly translation of the text accompanying this specific relief renders it as something close to the Great One who illuminates, or that which gives light. The mainstream reading treats this as a reference to Ra, the sun god, illumination as divine metaphor, tied to the broader creation narrative playing out around it on the surrounding walls. That reading is internally consistent. It fits comfortably with everything else carved into this temple. But sit with the wording for a second, stripped of assumption. That which gives light. That is also, word for word, exactly how you would describe an actual light-producing device to a religious audience 2,000 years before the word electricity existed, wrapping a functional technology inside the only vocabulary available to make it comprehensible and sacred. The genuinely honest conclusion here is that the inscription cannot settle the argument either way. It supports the sun god reading perfectly. It also supports a device reading perfectly. Text and image together are equally consistent with both interpretations, which means anyone claiming the inscription proves their side in either direction is overstating what the evidence actually shows. What it does do is remove the easiest dismissal. You cannot wave this away by saying, well, the words clearly just mean sunlight, because the words are exactly ambiguous enough to mean either. The carvings nobody talks about. Almost every popular video on this topic, and there have been a lot of them, focuses entirely on one single carving. The famous one, the one everybody's seen a photo of. It's not the only one. Catalogued across the South Crypt walls, researchers have identified at least 5 distinct bulb form reliefs, each slightly different, each preserving the same underlying structural relationship between an outer container and an internal element. In some, the serpent sits closer to the base of the bulb. In others, it extends nearly to the tip. The base connector varies in prominence and angle from relief to relief. The overall proportions shift slightly from one version to the next. If you're looking at this as symbolic religious art, variations on a creation myth, this is completely unremarkable. Different craftsmen, different moments, different emphases. Symbolic imagery is supposed to vary. That's what makes it expressive. But looked at as a technical set rather than 5 isolated images, a different pattern emerges. The base-to-bulb proportional relationship stays remarkably stable across all 5 carvings, the kind of stability you'd expect from a repeated structural template, not 5 independently imagined religious symbols. What changes consistently is the position of the internal serpent element. Here's the argument that framing invites. If this were purely mythological variation, you'd expect the whole image to shift with theological emphasis. The container, the connector, everything drifting together as the story around it changes. Instead, one specific part of the image, the internal element's position, moves, while the surrounding structure holds steady. That's a pattern more consistent with something showing the same device under different conditions than with 5 separate retellings of the same myth. Egyptologists who've studied this material closely maintain, reasonably, that this is still just the expected variation you'd see across any repeated religious motif carved by different hands over time. A completely normal feature of ancient temple art. That reading holds up. It fits the broader iconographic context of the temple without requiring anything we can't already explain. What the multi-carving comparison contributes is not a rebuttal to that reading. It's a second lens laid over the same evidence, one where the exact same visual variation that reads as artistic license under one interpretation reads as operational state under the other. Two frameworks, one set of carvings. Neither one is disprovable by looking harder at the stone. It's worth noting how rarely this kind of side-by-side multi-example comparison actually gets done in ancient mystery research generally. Most viral claims about impossible ancient artifacts rest on a single object, a single image, a single data point stretched to carry the weight of an entire theory. The moment you introduce 4 or 5 variations of the same motif and ask whether they behave more like a myth retold or a machine documented, you've raised the evidentiary bar considerably above where these conversations usually sit. That alone is part of why this particular case has outlived so many other ancient technology claims that quietly disappeared from serious discussion after a single afternoon of scrutiny. So where does that leave us? What we can say with confidence? The Dendera reliefs show a level of structural consistency across multiple examples that goes beyond a single lucky coincidence. The hieroglyphic text accompanying them is genuinely, provably ambiguous, not settled science dressed up as mystery, but an actual open question sitting in the translated academic record. The soot problem in nearby chambers is real and in several locations still unresolved. The Baghdad battery proves, beyond dispute, that the ancient world understood the basic principle of generating electrical current in exactly this period and this region. What we can't say that any of this proves ancient Egypt had electric lighting. The proportional resemblance could still be coincidence. The inscription could still simply mean sunlight and nothing more. The soot gap could still have a mundane explanation we haven't found yet. What Grok AI's analysis actually did wasn't answer the question. It reframed it, took a debate that had spent 60 years running on visual gut feeling and gave it, for the first time, a structured technical vocabulary to be argued in. It didn't hand anyone a verdict. It handed researchers a sharper set of questions and a clearer map of exactly which parts of the evidence are strong, which are ambiguous, and what it would actually take to move this from mystery to answer. That carving has been on that wall for over 2,000 years, asking the same question the entire time. We just finally learned how to ask it back. If this kind of ancient mystery is your thing, subscribe. And tell me in the comments which ancient Egyptian mystery you want put through AI analysis next.